Welcome, history students, to this presentation on the abolitionist movement, radicals and radical reactions. This is a very important presentation as we are making our way toward the Civil War. And we've already talked about the Second Great Awakening, but I reserved this part to talk about on its own. There were certainly some anti slavery Christians who, following the Second Great Awakening, thought this was another societal sin that should be addressed, that Christians ought to fight against the sin of slavery, and eradicate this from the national consciousness. But in the 1830s, this was really more of just a radical position. The abolitionist movement was considered very radical for its time. It will grow and become much more prominent by the time we get to the Civil War. But in the 1830s, it was really more the radical anti slavery group that would take the name abolitionist, and they will inspire some radical reactions as well. The difference between an abolitionist and someone who's just anti slavery was in how adamant they were that slavery come to an end and come to an end immediately. Now, there were some anti slavery people who thought slavery should be gradually ended, as it had been gradually ended in the North. Some were okay with a more gradual process in the South. And most still thought there must be some sort of compensation for those slave owners. They can't just have their property taken from them without any kind of compensation. But a true abolitionist didn't talk about compensation for owners. They didn't talk about gradually ending slavery. They wanted an immediate end to slavery without compensation. So we're going to be looking at the origins of this radical movement from the 1830s, some of the radical reactions that it's going to create. To do this, we have to go back a little bit, some of the things you've already been reading. So let's talk about the slavery problem. Slavery was a problem in the United States even just after the Revolutionary War. People north and south could recognize slavery is a problem. It didn't really fit with our national rhetoric about liberty, freedom. How can the United States talk so much about declaring independence and yet still hold a number of people in slavery? And all of those who would come after them, their children, grandchildren, and great grandchildren. Slavery was a problem, and people in the revolutionary generation realized it was a problem, but it was a problem that was postponed. The solutions were postponed. That first generation decided this was not something worth fighting over and preventing the coming together and agreeing on a constitution. So it's not it's a problem that sort of gets swept under the rug for a generation or two. But we're going to see where it emerges. Now, one organization that would be associated with the Second Great Awakening we talked about. There were Bible societies and tract societies and missionary societies, Sunday schools, all these religious reform societies, and other efforts to try to resolve society's sinful problems, whether that was temperance or Sabbath breaking. Well, here was another one, an American Colonization Society. Well, this was a group that wanted to solve the slavery problem. The Colonization Society thought they could end slavery by compensating owners for their slaves, purchasing slaves, and then sending those slaves back to Africa. That was their plan for a benevolent end to slavery. Owners would still be compensated, but slaves would be freed and sent back to their ancestral homeland in Africa. A lot of good-natured and well-meaning Christians embraced this idea. But it was not something that a lot of African Americans embraced, particularly free African Americans. Most of them did not really favor this plan. Because think of what this plan implies. The plan says whites and blacks cannot live here together equally. They could not get along here together. So if a slave is freed in America, the best thing for them is to be sent back to Africa. Well, back to Africa, what does that really mean? Not every slave has just recently come into the country. In fact, the international slave trade officially had been declared illegal in 1808. There is no more importation of people from Africa in 1808. So we're talking about the 1820s here with the American Colonization Society. There's a lot of people they're hoping to send back to Africa who don't remember Africa. They may have been slaves here for two, three, many generations ago. So where is the African Americans' home? Is Africa really home? Well, not to many of them. Now, the Colonization Society will still redeem a number of people. They will purchase slaves. They will send them back to Africa. There'll be the country of Liberia really based on these redeemed slaves who've gone back to the continent of Africa. But it ends up being a very small number. It's an expensive enterprise, and it's not going to be something that has a lot of free blacks support. So while they may have been well meaning, the Colonization Society is not a grand success for solving the slavery problem. Now, people really were reminded that this was a national problem at the beginning of the 1820s. You might recall in the reading that Missouri had enough people in its territory to propose being a state. Missouri would have been part of this much larger Louisiana Purchase. And Louisiana had already become a state. And now Missouri was applying for statehood. It seemed fairly routine. Lots of territories had done this already. But what was not routine is when Missouri applied for statehood, a Northern congressman suggested that Missouri be admitted as a state only if they end slavery. Only if they do not allow slavery in their state, and those slaves that are already there, well, um, slavery should not be passed on from them to their children. It should be gradually ended. Now, that was a suggestion that's going to spark a firestorm. Southern states are going to say, wait a minute, why are we making this a condition for becoming a state? It's never been a condition. It was not a condition for Mississippi and Alabama and Louisiana. No state already, no territory coming into the Union as a state has had this restriction, has had this, you must eliminate slavery or you won't be allowed to be a state. Southerners are very offended by this. Why are we mixing the whole issue of slavery and statehood in this Missouri application for slavery? Well, but many Northerners are just as adamant that slavery shouldn't just continue to spread. It was expected to probably die off shortly after the Revolutionary War. But because of the cotton gin, because cotton became such an integral, the most exported product from the country, slavery's become more and more and more entrenched in the southern United States. So this was really a crisis, the whole Missouri statehood problem. Well, you've already read about this, so I'll just remind you how the compromise comes about. Henry Clay, one of the great statesmen of this era, he's usually in the middle of compromises, and this is no different. Henry Clay wanted to develop some sort of compromise here. And there's multiple aspects to this, but ultimately, Missouri would be allowed into the Union as a slave state. But at the same time, Maine, who was still just a part of Massachusetts, Maine would be its own state, and they would enter the Union as a free state. So you still got an even number of slave states and free states. Everything is still even in the Senate. House of Representatives will have more people from the free states because they have more population, even when you count 3/5 of the slaves. So that seemed to have solved the problem temporarily. But the next part of the Missouri Compromise was Missouri was drafting a constitution that would have prevented even free blacks from coming into their state. They didn't want an example of free African Americans alongside the slaves. So, Henry Clay once again tries to compromise. Missouri, don't put that in your constitution. Don't say you're going to not welcome free blacks. They're American citizens. Ultimately, the compromise would be you might actually prevent blacks from coming into the state, but don't say it in your constitution. When you're applying for statehood, make a constitution that's not going to get so much attention. Well, this whole controversy over slavery, this whole Missouri Compromise, brought the slavery problem to the open, and a problem that had been ignored since the Revolutionary generation now was on people's minds again. Thomas Jefferson was still alive when this happened, and he compared this whole situation, America fighting about slavery. He said, this is like we've got a wolf by the ears. You can't hold on to that wolf forever, and yet you can't safely let it go. You let it go, it bites you. You get hurt. And you can't hold on to a wolf's ears forever either. This is a problem. Even Thomas Jefferson knew this is a problem, but we haven't really dealt with it just yet. Well, the way most Southerners talked about the slavery problem was that it was a necessary evil. Slavery might not be such a nice and good thing, but it was necessary. It was part of the whole economic system that had been inherited there. No Southerner invented slavery. It's something that was there when they were born. And it was, as old as the colonies. And historically, back in Europe, it went way before the colonies. So most Southerners would admit slavery is a problem, but there's no safe way, no logical plan to just end it suddenly. Well, we're going to start to see Southerners not just talk about it as a necessary evil, but to actually start defending slavery as well. The Missouri Compromise is part of this. I mentioned John C. Calhoun in an earlier presentation. This whole Missouri crisis will really affect Calhoun as well. Calhoun had been a great nationalist. He had been one of the big promoters of the national or the federal government. Not anymore. Calhoun was concerned that the more numerical North is going to force changes on the South. And so Calhoun starts using all of his creative political energy to defend the minority position. Minority being the South, not slaves. The minority he's trying to defend is the slave owning South. So, in the late part of the decade, late 1820s, a free black man named David Walker wrote a very explosive work called An Appeal to the Colored Citizens of the World. In this work, David Walker said, if we believe that there is a God who believes in justice, a God who cares about his creation, then we should tremble because he can't be happy about this slavery issue continuing on in America. God will eventually help those who are suffering to be freed. God is a God of justice, and that should wake Americans up. Walker says this is a national sin, and we should be afraid of what God's going to do to a nation that perpetuates slavery. Walker also he's talking directly to what he's calling the colored citizens of the world, African Americans here in this case. He says, you are not wrong if you fight for your freedom. If you have to fight to be free, even if you have to kill to be free, God does not frown on that. God understands that. So sometimes it is kill or be killed. And Walker suggests the slaves have justification for killing to get their freedom. Well, Walker's from the North. This was an explosive pamphlet. This is not something that Southern slave owners want these ideas expressed in the South at all. Um, and David Walker becomes really a wanted man by many people in the South. Walker ends up dying pretty early in kind of mysterious circumstances. There's some conspiracy theories surrounding his death. There's nothing really been proven that he was murdered in any way, but Walker Walker doesn't live much longer after this explosive work. But just on the heels of this, there's going to be a real slave rebellion, the most successful in American history in terms of the damage it does to slave owners. In 1831, a slave named Nat Turner from Virginia, and the painting here is depicting him talking to some of his closest associates. Nat Turner's was a slave in Virginia, and he had some freedom to leave the plantation when his work was done. His owner would allow him to go and visit other plantations, and he was somewhat of a religious leader. He's a preacher, and he talks to Christians, slaves about Christianity on other plantations. But he also has this vision. He dreams of drops of blood coming down off of the leaves, off of trees, and he believes this was a vision saying there's going to be a lot of bloodshed because of slavery. And he believes God is calling him to be his instrument. Go out and stop this sinful practice of slavery. You're going to have to go and kill the slave owner. So Nat Turner keeps this very quiet. He keeps his plan quiet. In the past, when there had been attempts at slave rebellions, usually word got out and the rebellion is stopped before it ever gets off the ground. But Turner just keeps it within a few people that he tells his plan to. And then one night, he and these friends go into the master's chamber, into the master's bedroom, and they'll kill the master and his wife while they're in their beds. And then they kill the children in their beds as well. His vision says there's going to be bloodshed from all. You kill all of the people involved in slavery. And through the night, they just move from house to house doing the same thing. Well, by the next morning, some visitors are going to have tried to go to a neighbor's house and realize everyone's been slaughtered, and word is going to spread. There's a rebellion going on. And each time they move to a different plantation, they pick up a few more rebels that want to take part. In the end, they had killed about 60 um, men, women, and children among Virginia plantation owners. And there will be swift retribution as well. Nat Turner and his men are captured, and he is brought to a speedy trial, and he's executed along with many others. But he does confess to these to his rebellion. He explains about his religious vision, and he believed he was doing what God had told him to do. Well, this struck fear in the hearts of a lot of Southerners. There's more slaves in Virginia than anywhere else. Virginia would have really been worried about this. South Carolina, even more so, because there, the slaves were the majority of the population. It was the only state in which that was the case. But this is what a lot of Southern slave owners feared the most. What if slaves, instead of accepting their lives as they are and not rebelling against it, what if they took up weapons and really fought? Well, it just so happened that in 1831, there was this abolitionist named William Lloyd Garrison, pictured to the left here. Garrison starts the first abolitionist newspaper called The Liberator. And Garrison had been, like other anti-slavery people in the past, he had even been a member of the Colonization Society. But now he was convinced those plans were too moderate. Now he decided he's done with being moderate. He doesn't want to talk in moderation. He wants to talk boldly, and he wants to be heard. So he says in his first issue of the Liberator, we're not going to compromise. We demand an immediate end to slavery without compensation to the owners. It is an evil that must be brought to an end. Now, Garrison will go on to create an organization called the American Anti-Slavery Society. This is an abolitionist society. And it's not really that, there's no definite connection between Nat Turner and William Lloyd Garrison. It's not that, Nat Turner read what Garrison was writing, but having these things happen so close together does grab the attention of a lot of Southern slave owners. There's abolitionist newspaper and there's a slave rebellion. It may not be a causation, but they believe there's a correlation. Where people are talking about abolishing slavery, you encourage slaves to take up arms and kill their masters, men, women, children. So this radical movement is going to create some radical reactions. Now, to illustrate that William Lloyd Garrison was quite radical for his time, we need to understand that he used some pretty outlandish ways to try to get his point across. Garrison did not believe that government is really going to solve this problem. He was not looking to the national government to draft a law or a new amendment that would end slavery. He really thought government has already accepted slavery. The Constitution does not condemn slavery, and the government has kind of just looked the other way as slavery has grown in the South. Garrison is not confident that government's ever going to do anything about this. One of the outlandish things he ends up doing is lighting the Constitution on fire, or shredding it in front of people in a speech, or at an abolitionist rally, because to him the Constitution is a slave document. It's a document that allowed slavery. He also does not believe churches are going to solve this problem. Now, Garrison would consider himself a Christian, but he's a Christian who's really given up on any organized churches. He believes churches are also complicit in this sinful behavior. Churches have allowed slavery to go on, and there are slave owners that are members of churches, and most churches haven't come out and condemned being a slave owner. Garrison thinks that they should have. So he's not expecting government to solve the problem. He's not expecting churches to solve the problem. What he's hoping to do is get people outraged about it enough, to get people in the North outraged about slavery so much that Southerners are shamed into changing. Keep in mind, he is speaking to a Northern audience. And he's hoping to get people there to care about slavery in the South. Most Northerners, whether they're really anti-slavery or not, they kind of shrug at whatever's going on in the South. They don't really care. That's a long way from them. Plus, there are some people in the North who make a living partly based on Southern slavery. If you work in a Northern textile manufacturing plant, then you profit from the cotton that is produced in the South. If you are involved in shipping, if you're a merchant and you have a shipping business, you also profit from those cotton exports. So there are a lot of people in Boston and in Rhode Island, in merchant kinds of states who don't like Garrison addressing this issue. They would rather him just leave it alone. He's trying to get people in the North outraged about slavery so that finally Southerners will cave in. They'll be ashamed of themselves and they'll just have to morally cave in. Well, he's not the only abolitionist out there. There were many others. We, of course, should know Frederick Douglass. This was the other most famous abolitionist of the time. Douglass was a um, was a former slave. Douglass had been a slave in Maryland and had escaped when he was a teenager. Because Maryland being right there on the border between slave and free states, gave him somewhat of an advantage. He could just get on a ship and act like he's a free black sailor and, manage to sail into the North and be free. Now, Douglass, for a while, worked with Garrison. He was a great object lesson of someone who could talk firsthand about slavery. Um, and eventually he'll go on his own. He'll have his own newspaper, his own speaking tour. There's some hard feelings here between Garrison and Douglass eventually, but Douglass was so articulate, many people didn't believe he had ever been a slave. How could a slave really speak so well, be this educated? Well, that was one good fortune for him, was that a lady in Maryland had taken the time to teach him how to read. Um, was really against the law for her to do so, but she did it. And Douglass benefited from that. And so he writes his whole story, his narrative of the life of Frederick Douglass. He writes it to convince people, I'm not making this up. I'm not a free black man who has just pretended to have been a slave. I really experienced slavery the first part of his life. Now, Douglass is going to have a slightly different message than Garrison. They both want to end slavery, but Douglass is not going to be tearing up a constitution. He's not going to be as critical just about America's founding documents being slave documents. No, Douglass would like to just see America live up to the principles it expresses in those documents. One of his most famous speeches came on the 4th of July, and he stands up in front of a crowd and says, I've been invited here to speak on a 4th of July occasion. I'm here speaking on Independence Day. Are you mocking me? Are you making fun of me? Because it's kind of ironic to have a black man, to have a former slave talk about independence. So he goes on to say, the 4th of July should be a great celebration, but for many black people, it's just a sad reminder that those promises are not for African Americans. So Douglass wasn't tearing up a constitution. He's not denigrating the Declaration of Independence. He's saying America should live up to these things. Black people love the promises that are embedded here as well. They just want to see them lived out. Now, there's other people important in the abolitionist movement. The Tappan brothers aren't always the speakers, but they are a lot of the money behind the abolitionist movement. These were a pair of very wealthy merchants from New York, and their money goes to help fund the printing of Garrison's paper and Douglass's paper. Uh, Tappan brothers, with their money, they can distribute a lot of these newspapers to people who've never really subscribed to these papers. Now, as they do, they're going to get some pretty radical reactions. On one occasion, the Tappan brothers open a package and someone has mailed them an ear of one of the slaves. Now, I'm not sure if there was a message with this ear, but the unspoken message was, you are making things worse for the slave. You're agitating about trying to end slavery, but you should just stay in New York and mind your own business, because all these newspapers you're trying to send to the South, you're just making things more difficult for the slave, because slave owners are doubling down and saying, we will defend this institution. We're not apologizing about this institution anymore. Well, another interesting abolitionist, Theodore Dwight Weld, another example of someone influenced by the Second Great Awakening. Weld had um, had been a part of a preacher training school. He was in a theological training school called Lane Theological Seminary, and um, that was in Cincinnati, Ohio. So imagine, this is a northern city, but it's just across the river, just across the Ohio River from Kentucky. So you just cross the river and you're in a slave state. So Cincinnati, even though it doesn't have slavery, it would have many of the habits, the attitudes about racial segregation that a southern state would have. Well, Theodore Dwight Weld and several other students from Lane um, had become abolitionists, and they met in mixed company with white and black, male and female, all in the same place. Very taboo for Cincinnati in the 1830s. You just didn't do that. You didn't have black men and white men and black women in the same public meeting space. So they get reprimanded by their school. And this is a preacher training school. This is a theological seminary. Well, Weld didn't think he should be getting reprimanded. He thought, if anything, they should be praising what these future preachers are doing. And if they were going to get reprimanded, then they would just transfer their tuition. He and these other lame rebels will end up going to a newfound Oberlin College, was quite a bit more liberal on the abolitionist movement. By the way, these schools did have some connection to important figures in the Second Great Awakening. Lane was a school that Lyman Beecher worked for. Now, Lyman Beecher was anti-slavery, but he wasn't an abolitionist. He thought that was an extreme position. Charles Finney, the other most famous revivalist of the period, he was a new professor of revivals at Oberlin. So Weld had gone to the newer school under the leadership of Charles Finney, and he's still connected to Christianity. He's not like Garrison, who has given up on all churches. He still believed churches ought to be making a difference here and ending slavery. Well, Weld is also not giving up on government. He's trying to get a lot of people to sign um, petitions to try to end slavery. And um, and they will flood Congress with these petitions that have many, many signatures. Now, the interesting thing here is that as Congress starts to receive more and more petitions about ending or curtailing slavery somewhere, Southerners in Congress insist those petitions would be a waste of time to consider here. There's no way any of those are going to be passed. So they just make a rule that says if there are petitions about ending slavery coming up, any kind of reduction of slavery, curtailment of slavery, they won't talk about them. Congress would just say, we have a gag rule. We don't discuss anti-slavery petitions. Now, this is going to be something, that inspires some people who weren't abolitionists to take more of an abolitionist side here. Okay, most famous congressman at this period was really former President John Quincy Adams. And John Quincy Adams was against slavery, but he wasn't an abolitionist. He wasn't agitating for slavery to end immediately in the South. He just thought this is something Southerners do, but it had nothing to do with his Massachusetts. But the gag rule really, really bothers him. A gag rule that says your petitions really they'll never be heard in Congress. John Quincy Adams makes it a point to always talk about this thing they're not supposed to talk about. He finds creative ways to bring up slavery or petitions against slavery, even when they're not supposed to. And it will irritate other congressmen, but he's the only congressman there, the only person in the House of Representatives who was a former president too. So he has some kind of extra authority there. And he'll fight against this gag rule all along, but for years, because it's one of the First Amendment rights, along with right to free speech, freedom of religion, freedom of assembly, freedom of petition. What good is the freedom to petition Congress if Congress says we won't read your petition? So John Quincy Adams fights against this until it is finally repealed in the later 1840s. I should also point out that, because we have talked about Andrew Jackson in here, Jackson takes a particular position here on abolitionist newspapers. I mentioned the Tappan brothers and their money that's going forth to send lots and lots of abolitionist newspapers, even to people in the South. Well, um, a lot of Southern postmasters thought this is revolutionary kind of material that should just be gathered and burned. None of these newspapers should be delivered. So post offices are a national office. And maybe local postmasters in the South that are deciding to burn these things and not deliver them. What's the president's position going to be? Is he going to say, that is the mail, you have an obligation to deliver the federal mail? No. Andrew Jackson's going to say, yes, this is very revolutionary, rebellious kind of literature. And if people aren't subscribing to it, if it's just being put in their mailboxes, then the postmaster has a right to destroy it. Another case where it seems Andrew Jackson leans to the states' rights side here. Now, by the way, if you were one of those few Southerners who was actually subscribing to this material, well, you're definitely going to make a lot of neighbors upset. People are going to know about this. So it certainly discouraged a lot of people from subscribing to abolitionist news. So the point of this slide, there's varieties of abolitionists, varieties of efforts to try to end slavery. And some of the reactions, like the gag rule, are actually going to bring more people into this anti-slavery camp. Whereas John Quincy Adams hadn't really fought hard against slavery that much before. He will with a gag rule. So let me finish up with just some of the impact, the influence that the abolitionists had. In the 1830s, because of the issue of slavery coming up, a lot of churches will divide. Now, it's not strictly because of slavery. There will be other theological issues that divide the Presbyterian church into a northern and southern part, but often it was slavery also. Arguments about slavery that will divide Presbyterians, Methodists, the Baptists into a northern and southern branch. Sometimes it went something like this. Among the Methodists, they have missionary societies. And when they're getting together to decide how they're going to distribute funds and send out missionaries, they'll find some of these want-to-be missionaries are actually slaveholders. And northern representatives will say, you can't be a slaveholder and a missionary. That's not Christian. You can't really be an evangelist sent out somewhere else and be a slaveholder. And Southern representatives will say, why not? The New Testament talks about how Christian owners are to treat their slaves and how they are really slaves of Jesus, and that they should treat their fellow man very well. And there's rules for how slaves ought to behave, especially if they have a Christian owner. They're to work hard, as if they're working for the Lord and not for man. Southerners don't see the problem. But a lot of Northerners are going to say, no, you can't be a slave owner and a missionary. And so they'll split Northern and Southern Methodist, Northern and Southern Baptist, Presbyterian. And as I said, there's other issues. Slavery's at the heart of a lot of these divisions. Long before the United States divides into a North and South for the Civil War, the churches had already done the same thing. There's also a lot of Northern opposition. I already mentioned this a little bit with William Lloyd Garrison. He's going to irritate a lot of people in Boston. His offices are burned. At one speech, he is attacked. He's tied up behind a horse and he's dragged through the streets. That's not in Atlanta, Georgia. It's not in Charleston, South Carolina. He's being attacked and physically accosted in Boston, in northern cities. There was a lot of northern opposition to the abolitionists. Um, the one abolitionist newspaper writer who was actually killed for his convictions was a man named Elijah Lovejoy. He's killed in Illinois. It's a state that had never had legalized slavery. But there are a number of people there that don't like that he is taking such a radical position and insisting on slavery ending. There was a lot of northern opposition to slavery. And the thing to end on here is the Southern defense of slavery. I've kind of hinted at this already, but this is very important. Abolitionism may have been a radical movement in the 1830s, but it's going to inspire some radical reactions. A good illustration of this, even though it comes a couple of decades later, but George Fitzhugh was probably the most exemplary Southerner for defending slavery and comparing it favorably to what Northern society is like. Fitzhugh was a Virginian, and he wrote a couple of different books. One of them is called Cannibals All. He wrote books about comparing Northern and Southern society. And ultimately, he would say Southern society is much preferable. And he would say slavery is preferable to the Northern system of labor. Because he believed in the North, people are paid very little to work in a factory. You know, some Irishman has come into the country and they're going to be paid hardly anything to work in that factory. Conditions will not be safe. They have a good chance of being hurt or maimed or killed on the job, and no one will care about them. They'll be replaced by the next Irishman off the boat. But Fitzhugh, the way he paints society in the South, he says, in the South, they're not just all groups of individuals. It's not just me, dog eat dog world. In the South, he says there's harmony. There's a hierarchy, husbands are the head of the family, wives know that. And husbands and wives know that they are the head of the children. But he believed in the South there is harmony. There's hierarchy, but harmony. And slaves, though they may be at the bottom of that hierarchy, they know their place and they're happy in their place. And everyone gets along. It's a harmonious society where slaves are still taken care of, even in their old age, when they're not so useful as workers. They will still be cared for as a member of the family. They're still fed, they're still clothed. They don't have to worry about the basic necessities of life. As far as Fitzhugh is concerned, he would say people of African origin, people of African origin, you know, um, are happier not having to worry about those basic necessities of life. He thought they're happier not being free. He believed they are better off than they would have been in an African tribe. At least in America, they have had a chance to be exposed to Christianity, Western civilization. But in the North, Fitzhugh says it's a dog eat dog world. It's cannibals all. It's white people eating each other up. It's complete individualism in the North. It's community in the South. Now, I'm not asking you to buy wholeheartedly this Fitzhugh position. Um, he paints a very overly rosy picture of what Southern slave society would have been like. But a lot of his criticism of the treatment of factory workers in the North is right on too. Um, so there's a lot of people who will pay attention to him. But he's just one example of many who would be defending slavery now. John C. Calhoun will be doing the same thing. This generation of Southerners are not going to sound like Thomas Jefferson did a little earlier, when Jefferson would recognize slavery is a problem, but it's a necessary evil that we have inherited. There's no easy solution for it. No, Southerners in the 1830s and beyond are going to say slavery is a good institution. It's better for the slave. They're better off here than they would be in the North, better off here than they would be free back in Africa. So, abolitionism was a radical movement for the 1830s, and it does inspire some very radical reactions, especially with this defense of slavery. That's it for this presentation. Come back for more. I'll see you.